Imagine being 90 years old, surrounded by the loud engines of intimidating bikers who think they can push you around. That's exactly what happened to one courageous veteran. For years, this quiet, elderly woman lived her life in peace. But when a group of rowdy bikers started bullying her, she reached her breaking point. What they didn't know was that they had just made a grave mistake. One simple phone call would change everything, and the power behind that call left everyone speechless. This isn't just a story of injustice. It's a story of resilience, bravery, and the unexpected twists that life can throw your way. How could a 90-year-old woman stand up to such intimidation? Well, wait until you hear who she called and what happened next. Trust me, you won't believe your ears. Stay tuned for the shocking turn that no one saw coming. For years, this veteran, Mrs. Evelyn Harris, had lived alone in a small house on the outskirts of town. Her life had been full of challenges, serving in a war, losing loved ones, and battling health issues. But she had always remained strong. Known for her quiet strength, Evelyn was respected by the few who knew her, yet she was often overlooked by the world around her. That was until the bikers came into town. It started with loud revs outside her house late at night. Then it turned into taunts and threats. At first, she tried to ignore them, hoping they'd eventually move on. But the intimidation only grew worse. They would park right in front of her driveway, blocking her in, and shout insults from their bikes. Evelyn had been a fighter in her youth, but now at 90, she didn't know how much more she could take. That's when she made the call. What happened next is beyond what anyone could have predicted. The bikers had no idea who they were dealing with. As their noise and harassment grew, they began to push Evelyn's patience further. They weren't just messing with an old woman. They were targeting someone who had lived through war, hardship, and countless battles of her own. Still, Evelyn tried to stay calm, hoping it would stop. But every day, the attacks grew more brazen. They'd make rude gestures, spit on her porch, and once even threw eggs at her house. One night, the leader of the bikers, a man named Rick, stood in her driveway, grinning like it was all a joke. He had a reputation for bullying those weaker than him, and to him, Evelyn was just an easy target. But there was something in Evelyn's eyes that night, a quiet, unspoken fury that sent a chill down his spine. For the first time, Rick began to wonder if maybe they had pushed too far. Evelyn didn't flinch. Instead, she turned and walked inside, her hands trembling but resolute. She picked up the phone. The call she was about to make would change everything. The question was, who could she possibly be calling that would put an end to the harassment once and for all? Who would stand with her, an old woman against a gang of intimidating bikers? Evelyn knew that whatever happened next, there was no turning back. Evelyn's hand shook as she dialed a number. She had made this call only once before, years ago, when she was still a young woman. Back then, it had been to a comrade from her military days. But now, with the weight of decades of experience and wisdom on her shoulders, she knew this was the moment that would either break her or put an end to the torment. She inhaled deeply, waiting for the line to pick up. "Hello," a gravelly voice answered. Evelyn didn't need to say much. He knew who it was the moment he heard her voice. "Rick and his gang are here again," she said, her voice low but steady. "I need your help." The voice on the other end of the line was silent for a long moment. Then a single word echoed through the receiver. "Done." Evelyn didn't wait for further questions. She hung up, her heart racing. It wasn't the first time she called in favors, but this call was different. The man on the other end wasn't just anyone. He was someone whose reputation stretched far beyond what Rick and his gang could ever imagine. This was someone who had connections with people who didn't take kindly to bullies. Outside, the bikers were getting louder. their bikes revving in the night air as they laughed and mocked her. Evelyn walked to the window, her mind racing. She had done everything she could to avoid confrontation, but now there was no going back. She didn't know exactly what would happen next, but she could feel the tension building. Something big was coming. The night was still, too still. It was as if the entire town had held its breath. Evelyn could hear the rumbling of the bikes growing nearer. She knew this was the moment. Would she be able to stand firm, or would the bikers take it too far? And just when she was about to step outside to face them, the unmistakable sound of roaring engines filled the air. But this time, it wasn't Rick and his gang. Something was different. The question now was, what had she set in motion? And was she ready for what was about to unfold? The engines roared louder, growing closer by the second. Evelyn's heart skipped a beat. She stepped back from the window, every muscle in her body tense. But the sound wasn't coming from the bikers this time. It was something else, something bigger, more powerful, and unmistakable. She held her breath as headlights cut through the darkness, a line of sleek motorcycles speeding toward her house. But these weren't Rick's gang. These were polished, professional riders, their black leather jackets adorned with patches that Evelyn knew all too well. Her fingers tightened around the edge of the windowsill as she stared, stunned, at the sight before her. The gang of bikers that had been tormenting her had just driven into a trap, and they had no idea. As the riders pulled up to her house, they didn't even notice the figure walking toward them from the shadows, someone with a presence that made even the toughest bikers falter. It was her old friend, Sergeant Major Lewis, a name feared in the underground world of outlaw bikers. He was a man who had seen it all, had led men in battle, and had connections that reached deeper into the criminal underworld than Rick could ever dream. Evelyn had called him not just for protection, but for the kind of reckoning that only someone like him could deliver. She had made one phone call to a man who wasn't afraid of putting people in their place, especially bullies who thought they could push around an elderly veteran. Rick's gang began to realize something was wrong as they looked around, their eyes widening with confusion and fear. Sergeant Major Lewis's crew wasn't just here to talk. The tension in the air thickened as Evelyn's gaze met Lewis from across the yard. Her mind raced. What was about to happen? Was Rick's gang going to back down, or would this escalate even further? Before she could make a move, a voice rang out from the leader of the bikers, Rick himself, challenging Lewis. "You think you can scare us, old man?" His words were filled with bravado, but even he seemed unsure of his next move. Evelyn's pulse quickened. She could set this in motion, but now, standing on the precipice, she wasn't sure where it would all lead. The stakes were higher than ever, and the clash between these two worlds was about to explode in ways none of them could have predicted. For a tense moment, everything was still. The bikers' engines hummed low in the background, their shadows flickering in the streetlights. Rick stood in front of Sergeant Major Lewis, his face twisted with defiance, yet there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. He had no idea who he was dealing with. Sergeant Major Lewis stepped forward, his voice steady and commanding. "You've crossed a line, Rick," he said, his words measured, each one dripping with authority. "And now you're going to answer for it." Rick snorted. "You're going to take us down, old man. You think you intimidate us." The bikers behind him shifted uncomfortably. They had heard of Lewis, of course. Stories of his past, his military background, and his no-nonsense approach to justice. But seeing him now, standing before them with his crew, they realized they had underestimated the situation entirely. Without warning, Lewis gave a sharp signal. A few of his riders, quiet and calculating, moved into position around Rick's gang. The tension snapped like a taut rope. Rick's crew hesitated for a fraction of a second, unsure whether to back down or charge. But before they could make a decision, Lewis's men had surrounded them. "You've made a grave mistake," Lewis continued, his voice cold. "Now you have two choices. You leave this town tonight and never come back. Or we take this to a level you won't be able to walk away from." Rick's jaw clenched. He knew he wasn't dealing with amateurs anymore, but he wasn't one to bow down either. "You don't scare me," he spat, his bravado returning. "We don't take threats from anyone, especially not from some washed-up vet." Evelyn, watching from her porch, felt her heart race. She had prayed this moment would never come, but here it was. The storm she had called down was upon them. Yet as the standoff continued, she sensed something was off, like there was one more piece of the puzzle she hadn't anticipated. And then, just when it seemed like a fight was inevitable, the ground rumbled with a low, ominous growl. Another engine, much larger than any bike, roaring toward them. From behind a line of trees, an armored vehicle emerged, its headlights piercing through the night. The bikers froze. The vehicle stopped just yards from where the confrontation was taking place, its door swinging open. To Rick's shock, the person who stepped out of the vehicle was none other than Evelyn's old friend, someone even more unexpected than Sergeant Major Lewis. Asterisk asterisk, her own daughter asterisk asterisk. Her daughter, Sarah, who had spent years in law enforcement and now led a covert task force of high-ranking officers, stepped forward, her eyes locked onto Rick. She was holding a badge and a look of utter resolve. "Did you really think you could mess with my mom and get away with it?" she asked, her voice calm but deadly serious. Evelyn's heart stopped. She had kept Sarah's involvement with law enforcement a secret from everyone, even her old military friends. Sarah had been in deep cover, gathering intel, and had finally tracked down Rick's crew for months. This wasn't just about protecting Evelyn anymore. It was about taking down an entire criminal operation that had been terrorizing towns for years. Rick's arrogance crumbled in the face of this unexpected force. His crew, seeing the entire situation unravel, started to back away, their tough exteriors faltering. One by one, they dropped their aggressive postures and began to realize the gravity of what they had gotten themselves into. Sergeant Major Lewis stepped aside, giving a nod to Sarah. "You've got this, Lieutenant," he said. Sarah didn't need any more words. With a few swift commands, her team moved in to arrest Rick and his gang, who now stood with their hands raised in surrender. The confrontation that had started with terror and uncertainty ended in complete submission. But just as Sarah turned to face her mother, Evelyn's expression shifted. A deep, knowing look crossed her face. Something wasn't quite right. She looked back at the bikers, her eyes scanning them carefully. Rick's men were beaten, sure, but there was still one man standing in the back who hadn't moved. A man Evelyn had recognized immediately. Rick's second in command, Tony, was staring at Evelyn with cold, calculating eyes. He hadn't made a move, but his expression told a different story. He wasn't afraid of Sarah or the law. He was waiting for something. Evelyn's blood ran cold as she realized the final twist. Tony wasn't just part of the gang. He had been working with someone much more dangerous than anyone could have imagined. Before anyone could react, Tony pulled out a small device and pressed a button. The ground beneath them trembled again. But this time, it wasn't just the sound of bikes or vehicles. It was a signal. And in that moment, Evelyn knew, with a chilling certainty, that the real battle was only just beginning. As the ground trembled underfoot, Evelyn's instincts kicked in. The device Tony had activated wasn't a bomb. It was a signal, a warning. Within seconds, law enforcement moved into position, securing the area and taking Tony into custody before he could make another move. Sarah's team had already been monitoring Tony's connections, and they were prepared for his attempt at a last-minute escape. Rick and his gang were hauled away, their bravado shattered. Evelyn watched as the chaos that had taken over her life for weeks began to subside. She stood by her daughter, who gave her a proud, relieved smile. In the days that followed, news broke that Tony had been part of a larger criminal syndicate, one that had been under investigation for years. Thanks to Evelyn's courage, the entire operation was finally exposed, bringing justice to countless victims. Evelyn had faced down bullies in every form throughout her life. This time, she didn't just stand up for herself. She stood for everyone who had ever been pushed around. And in doing so, she proved that no matter the age, the fight for what's right is never over.